Naughty Dog, in my eyes, have been on a downward trajectory ever since The Last of Us came out. I love the Uncharted trilogy, and The Last of Us is great, albeit not as utterly mind-blowing and revolutionary as the gaming press made it out to be. Then in 2014, the standalone DLC Left Behind came out, which I was not a big fan of. In 2016, Uncharted 4 came out. It was meant to conclude the story of Nathan Drake in a grand way, but for me it was a bit of a letdown. The only part that truly resonated with me was the heartfelt and surprising epilogue. That's not to say it's bad, but it didn't make much of an argument for its own existence or provide me with memorable moments like Uncharted 2 and 3 did. Instead, it was filled with contrived characters and plot advancements rather than being a clever farewell that tied the series together. The Lost Legacy is Uncharted 4's Left Behind, a standalone, single-player DLC side story, but this time it's not a prequel. It takes place after the events of Uncharted 4. It also includes Uncharted 4 multiplayer and survival mode content that I did not touch and consequently will not be reviewing. This is the second spin-off in the Uncharted franchise, the first being PS Vita's Golden Abyss, but the first where you don't play as Nathan Drake. The Lost Legacy pairs Nadine Ross from Uncharted 4 and Chloe Frazer from 2 and 3 together. The pairing is bizarre for me. It pairs my favorite side character in the series with my least favorite side character in the series. Chloe was interesting, with a real personality that appealed to the darker, thieving side of Nathan Drake in contrast to Elena Fisher. On the opposite end, Nadine was one of those contrived characters in Uncharted 4 that I was mentioning earlier. She came out of nowhere, had no personality, and existed purely to be a roadblock for Nathan Drake. Just as she was in Uncharted 4, Nadine is once again being paid to be here, this time by Chloe, who is searching for an Indian artifact in a lost city. The game drops you in with no context, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but how little of it is revealed later on makes the plot come off as half-assed. What is effectively a prologue starts off in a war-torn Indian city where Chloe and Nadine make their way to the main villain's storeroom of plundered antiquities to steal a disc that will lead them to the lost city. By the way, that villain, Asav, is absolutely laughable. In the previous games, the villains were also a cliché, but ended up being relegated to the background while characters like Sully and Drake himself demanded your attention enough to distract from how silly they were. With this more subtle and small main cast, a lot more attention is brought to how flawed and boring he is. He highlights the problem of how there is no character that takes the place of Nathan Drake. This villain's backstory is that he leads an Indian rebel faction that has engulfed India in a violent civil war. They say that he has no regard for the history of his people, selling priceless artifacts to fuel his war efforts, but then towards the end of the game, he proudly proclaims that he has the blood of the young king flowing through his veins. So which is it?
An expert in their culture and history.
My rates are reasonable.
A parasite who exploits our struggle in order to fatten her pockets.
It's almost like Naughty Dog watched my Uncharted 4 review, because this game tries really hard to give personality to Nadine. It's revealed that Nadine has actually worked for Asav in the past, but some vague bad thing happened that made her stop. Since Nadine is dying for more context and backstory, it feels like a real missed opportunity to not have given her a playable flashback sequence. Maybe showing how she helped him acquire some of the items in his collection that we see in the early moments of the game. Her character arc is resolved by her having a change of heart in the last act, but it comes off so stiff and predictable, as if this is just what has to happen to justify having her as a protagonist. Then there's Chloe's subplot, which is even less tangible than Nadine's. Chloe's father was also looking for this lost city and ended up dying in the process. This story is delivered through conversations between Nadine and Chloe in the most skeletal way possible. Then a cutscene will mention the father and expect you to care. This could have actually been a decent subplot that worked in a flashback or two that let us play as the father. Maybe something showing how he got the small artifact that Chloe has, or him exploring the same ruins that his daughter is, that tied the flashback to the present by helping you solve a puzzle. There's really a world of possibilities in there, but none of that ever happens, because the plot and characterization in The Lost Legacy are lazy and shallow. The relationship between Chloe and Nadine is unnuanced to the point of being boring. It doesn't help that a lot of the edge that Chloe had in Uncharted 2 and 3 is absent here for some inexplicable reason. Nadine is straight-laced and serious, while Chloe is more of an improviser, which leads to a few ultimately meaningless conflicts throughout the course of the story. With the subtlety of a children's movie, Chloe eventually softens Nadine, and they become friends by the end. Just like Uncharted 4, nothing supernatural happens on screen, though some supernatural elements seem to be implied. I find it funny that this is the one thing that Naughty Dog seems to think shakes things up. Not making better villains, reinvigorating the format, or writing a more complex narrative. I'll take the absurd blue humanoids in Shambhala over dry exposition, poorly written characters, and vacant appeals to emotion any day. At least Shambhala was exciting. Another thing the Lost Legacy inherits from Uncharted 4 is the visuals, which still look great. For those of you that have a PS4 Pro, it runs at 1440p, but even at the 1080p I played it at on the original PS4, this is still one of the best, if not the best, looking game on console. It runs at a mostly steady 30 FPS, though I did notice some rather serious frame drops at a few points, something I don't recall encountering in Uncharted 4. The only thing left now is the gameplay, which is the same as Uncharted 4 with some light embellishments here and there. I noticed some new guns like the silenced pistol, and there's now a lock-picking mechanic. Aside from that, you'd be hard-pressed to tell that this came out over a year after Uncharted 4. It's not much of a problem though, the more arcadey nature of the gunplay and stealth are as fun as they always were. The first big area was touted as being this impressively large and open level that dwarfed anything found in previous Naughty Dog games and provided more player choice and exploration. It is large and open, but it's only the illusion of choice. There are a handful of towers that you drive to, fight some enemies at, and then do a light puzzle to complete that area. At the end of the day, all of these towers are the same shit, and it probably doesn't matter what order you do them in. Exploring the ancient structures is enjoyable, as it always is, but with each new release, exploration becomes less exciting and more predictable. The architecture is gorgeous to look at, but I felt like I was running through it on autopilot. The puzzles found within are the most simplistic and derivative yet. There's one in particular that's basically just a remake of the shadow puzzle from Uncharted 3. Don't get me wrong though, the Lost City itself is leaps and bounds above what you would find in most other games, but that sense of awe that I used to feel when playing these Uncharted games is gone. The climactic level involves a train and driving a buggy in between. The train level was incredible in Uncharted 2, and the convoy chase in Uncharted 4 was a little less cool since it was essentially an updated version of a similar moment in Uncharted 2. In The Lost Legacy, it feels repetitive. Nothing whatsoever has been done to shake things up. If anything, it's a downgrade from what has come before. That's my overall impression. Paint-by-numbers Uncharted game design with a mostly bland cast of characters, an underwhelming story that add up to The Lost Legacy being worse than every Uncharted game that's come before, save for Golden Abyss, which wasn't even made by Naughty Dog. So what, if anything, is good about The Lost Legacy? Well, I found the length to be great, especially for $40, and despite all the negatives I've covered, this is not an outright bad game. It's just bad in comparison to earlier entries in the series, and has some deep flaws that drag it down. Nothing about it made me want to stop playing, but it did make me wonder if this was truly the best Naughty Dog could come up with. I'm feeling around a 6 out of 10 on The Lost Legacy. It's a decent but inessential game that doesn't add much, if anything, to Uncharted 4.